Hi, good morning. I want to get started on time because we have a lot of information to cover. So really thank you for coming here today and being a part of our parent workshop series. That's what we would like to. The counseling department wants to start sponsoring workshops once a month. It takes a little time to get them going, but we're hoping to have them every one Wednesday a month. Hopefully around Wellness Wednesday. This one was a week later because there was a lot going on in January. My name is Catherine Howard, and I am the therapist and counselor here at Chaminade. I'm very excited to have our presenter here with us today. She's someone I've been working with, and I really respect her assessments and her thorough evaluation of our students. So I invited her to come and speak. We talked about what we wanted to present on, and what I've been noticing is parents calling me about their students who have ADHD or learning difficulties. I'm the therapist, so anxiety and maybe some depression, but how those things can be combined. And is it anxiety or depression? Is it ADHD? Is it learning difficulties? How do you assess for that? So Laura McDonald is here, and she has this amazing office that offers a variety of supports for students who are struggling. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then she has this fantastic presentation about how do you help? What are some strategies you can use to help your child who's struggling? So I just want to welcome her, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Dr. Laura McDonald, and I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist. So I work with children, teens, and young adults. And what a neuropsychologist does is really testing or evaluations. So parents or families come to me with a variety of questions. So oftentimes I get questions like, my child has a hard time paying attention. Could it be ADHD? My child struggles academically. They seem really smart, but it's just so hard for them. They have to put so much effort into their schoolwork. Is there a learning disability? Or it could be, my child struggles with anxiety, or there might be some depression. There might be language or visual difficulties. So it's really a variety of different things. And what a neuropsychological evaluation does is we'll look at all areas of neurocognitive functioning. So it's a very thorough evaluation. We'll look at intelligence. What is the child's or the teen's potential? What is their ability intellectually? How do they process information? Are they more verbal or are they more visual? We'll look at how they learn and how they remember. So what is their learning style? How should information be presented to them so they can really absorb the material? We look at how they do in terms of attention and executive functioning, which is something we'll talk about more today. How are they doing academically? How are they doing time versus on time? Is that an issue? What is their processing style like? And how are they doing emotionally and socially? So, are there symptoms of anxiety or depression? How is their self-esteem? How is their confidence? And once we do that evaluation, we'll get a really good sense of how that child learns, what are their strengths, what are weaker areas, and then we're able to utilize their strengths to support them with any weaknesses. And we're able to put kind of a roadmap together of, where to go from here. What are some supports that might be helpful for that child? So I am in private practice. I've been in private practice for about 9 years, and I have an office in Encino. And there we take a little bit of more holistic approach to to cite some of these psychological things that we might see. So we have a multidisciplinary team. So I'm the neuropsychologist, but then we also have a therapist who focuses on working with families and with children individually. And then we have an educational therapist who really helps with homework, helps with strategies. Those are some things we'll talk about more today as well. So it's really different, multidisciplinary team coming together from different specialties so we can kind of treat the child really in a more holistic type of way. I'm also a mom. I have 3 kids, and my kids are 12, 10, and 7 years old. All right, so let's get started. We'll talk about attention difficulties and learning difficulties today, and how to best, how to recognize them, what do they look like, and then how to support them. So let's start with ADHD. What is ADHD? ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's not something that's acquired through a brain injury or a trauma. It's something that's more long-standing, that has been there since the child was younger. Symptoms can vary as the child grows and even into adulthood, but it is something that persists. There oftentimes is a genetic component to ADHD. So oftentimes when I do a feedback in my sessions, oftentimes one of the 2 parents, can kind of identify with some of these symptoms and feel, you're kind of describing me. I can really identify with those struggles. There's a difference in brain anatomy in kids with ADHD. So if we do brain scans, we find that in terms of structure, the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with ADHD, is smaller in size in kids with ADHD versus those who don't have ADHD. We also find differences in brain activity, in terms of brain waves, for instance, and then also in terms of how the brain metabolizes. There are differences in neurotransmitter activity. Dopamine in particular is implicated, and in kids with ADHD, the dopamine doesn't get as effectively to those frontal lobes. So it's not a problem with willpower or laziness. There are actual underlying, physiological differences that make attention so difficult for them and affect impulsivity and hyperactivity. We find that about 5 to 11% of the population has ADHD, and that number is pretty consistent across different cultures. Let's talk about the different symptoms of ADHD. There's 2 groups of symptoms. One of them are the inattentive symptoms. So those are kids that have a hard time focusing. They have a hard time sustaining their effort. They daydream. They might zone out. I get parents that say, when my child was younger, I would, ask them questions or talk to them, and they just wouldn't respond. And I didn't know if there was something wrong with their hearing, so I got a hearing test for them. They might be forgetful, so they may leave their jackets and lunch boxes at school all the time. They forget to bring their books from their locker. They leave their homework at home. They oftentimes do their homework, but they forget to turn it in. Those are all symptoms of inattention. Now, everyone will show symptoms of inattention from time to time. So that's normal. The difference with ADHD is that more of those symptoms will be present and they're more severe. So they really are impacting the individual's functioning. Where it becomes a problem academically, oftentimes there might be issues in their home because of these symptoms. It might affect them socially. And these symptoms occur across different settings. So it wouldn't just be at school that there's an issue or just at home, but you would see these issues in different settings. So at school, at home, maybe socially, maybe in extracurricular activities. Maybe they have a hard time, listening to the coach as well. Then the other group of symptoms are the hyperactive or impulsive symptoms. So those are the kids that are kind of bouncing off the walls. They have a hard time sitting still. They might be fidgety. Their hands might always be going. And then the more impulsive symptoms would be, blurting out answers rather than raising their hand. They might be constantly interrupting. They might have a hard time thinking about the consequences before they engage in the behavior. So when we diagnose ADHD, there's really 3 diagnoses. One of them is ADHD inattentive type, and that was formerly known as ADD. So those would be the ones from the first group, right? The ones that have a hard time paying attention. And it's not uncommon for kids who are smart and who have a good memory with these inattentive symptoms to get by when they're younger. In elementary school, where really the focus is on rote memorization, they can kind of sit in class and then they'll kind of zone out, but they fill in the gaps. And oftentimes it's not until middle school or high school where the academic demands increase that they're starting to hit the wall and the symptoms just become more of a problem for them. Another group would be, or another diagnosis would be ADHD impulsive hyperactive type. So those would be the ones that are only hyperactive impulsive and don't have attention problems. That's extremely rare. I've actually never seen that. More common is ADHD combined type. So those would be kids that have a hard time with hyperactivity, impulsivity, but they also struggle with inattention or executive functioning. Now, it's really important to rule out other difficulties. So different issues can present like ADHD, for instance, anxiety or depression. So a child who is anxious might be sitting in class and they're constantly thinking about their anxious thoughts. They're ruminating. So they're not paying attention to what's going on, but it's not because they have an attention, problem. It's not ADHD, it's because they're anxious. Or a child who's depressed. A child who's depressed is gonna have a hard time paying attention and focusing. Or you could have a child who has a learning disability. Where really things are kind of going over their head, and now they're not following anymore, so they're just starting to zone out because now you've lost them, right? So there's different things that can look like ADHD, which is why it's really important to do a thorough evaluation so we can look at all of those areas and the child's overall functioning. So it's not, I don't love it when, people go to maybe a pediatrician and do a 5-minute checklist and then are given a medication, because that might just not be the issue, and treatment looks very different based on what the underlying issue is. So let's talk about the name ADHD. Attention deficit is really a misnomer. It's not that these kids cannot pay attention. In fact, they can hyper-focus. So I get parents that say, my child can't have ADHD because they can play video games for 4 hours and not blink, right? So these kids can actually pay attention really well to something that they're interested in. It's paying attention to something that's not engaging or that doesn't include an immediate reward. That's where the challenge lies. So, and you might say that's kind of all of us, and it is, for all of us it's going to be easier when we're interested in something, when there's motivation. But for those of us that don't have ADHD, we might be sitting in class and we're, listening to the teacher, and then we're kind of zoning out, and then we can bring our attention back. Maybe it's probably going to be on the test, I probably should pay attention. The child with ADHD, they will zone out much more often, and it costs them it takes much more effort to bring their attention back. And oftentimes when they zone out, they will kind of go from topic to topic to topic before they realize, oh my gosh, I just missed 15 minutes. I have to focus again. Executive functioning is an umbrella term for difficulties with, so executive functioning includes kind of being able to prioritize, plan and organize, and execute something, a project, life in general. And almost everyone with ADHD has trouble with executive functioning. In fact, ADHD is sometimes called a disorder of executive functioning. However, you can have problems with executive functioning and not have ADHD. Executive functioning, those are skills that develop until our mid-20s, so no teenager is going to be great with executive functioning. But in kids with ADHD, we find that their executive functioning is about 3 years behind that of their peers. So really, we have to think of them, of a child about 3 years younger in terms of their executive functioning, even if they're incredibly smart and, great in other areas. So one area of executive functioning is planning and organizing. So those would be kids that have a hard time organizing their materials. So their locker might be a mess, their desk is messy, their backpack is a black hole. They may struggle with organization in general, being able to keep a calendar, knowing how to break things down, make things more manageable. Other kids might struggle with prioritizing and time management. So really being able to understand how long a task will take and then breaking that up, in your calendar. If you have several things to do that evening, one is a test that's worth 40% of your grade and one is a little homework assignment, do you understand that you have to devote that much more time to the big test versus, the little homework assignment? Working memory. Working memory is the ability to hold information in your mind while you do something with it. So if you give your child or your teen, 3 instructions, can they hold on to all of that? Or do they do one and then get lost? If the teacher asks a question and the teen raises their hand for the answer, but then the teacher goes to someone else first and then to the child, do they still remember what they wanted to say, or did they forget? Reading comprehension. Do they read a passage and get to the end of the page and have no idea what they just read and have to reread it? Those are all examples of working memory. Task initiation. So that's getting started on tasks. So kids that struggle with that, they have a really hard time just to get going. Once they start it, they might be able to do it quite well, but it's the task of getting yourself started. So those are the ones that get up 10 times to get a drink of water, get a snack, use the restroom. Managing emotion. So do they have a hard time with emotional regulation? Do they go, from 0 to 60 very fast? Or have a big emotional reaction over like a seemingly small thing? And are they able to learn from past mistakes? So in terms of treatment, there's different, treatment options for ADHD. One of them for more moderate to severe ADHD might be medication. There's a couple of groups, there's stimulants and non-stimulants. There's a lot of variability between individuals. It works really well for some, it doesn't work at all for others, and then some are from mild to moderate in between. There can be side effects with medication. Therapy is something that can be really helpful for individuals with ADHD. So therapy can directly teach the teen their lagging skills. It can focus on negative behaviors and kind of help them with that. It can help with self-esteem and confidence. Experts find that by about age 12, a child with ADHD gets about 20,000 more negative comments from the outside world than a child who doesn't have ADHD. So that really affects, a child's self-esteem and how they feel about themselves. And it's hard for them to separate their behavior from who they are as a person. So it starts to affect, about, what they think, who they are. So working on that, parent coaching can be really helpful because it's really, really tough to raise a child who has ADHD. Because you're constantly repeating the same thing over and over again. Something that should have become a habit, you're still telling them every single day. You're going through the same morning routine every single day. So it is very frustrating. So learning some different strategies around that. Collaborative problem solving can be really helpful for that. Working with the child to come up with strategies and solutions. And then treating any co-occurring anxiety or depression, which can be present in about 50% of kids with ADHD. Now, to address the executive functioning that we talked about, educational therapy can be really, really helpful. So educational therapy is different from tutoring. It's about teaching them strategies and teaching them study skills and work habits. So they use content that they might have to work on for school, but it's really to teach kind of more overarching strategies. So, for something like time management, really sitting with the child and, talk with them and have them think about how long they think it's going to take them to study for this big project or paper that they have to. And then take out the calendar. And now that you know how long it's going to take, back it up. Make sure that their calendar not only includes their academic activities, but also any extracurricular thing they have going on, any social events that take up time, so we can really plan out their week. Helping them organize their binders, their backpacks, and it's important to not just do it for them, but to do it with them so they can learn how to do it. The goal is to eventually get them to a place where they can do those things on their own. Task initiation, oftentimes kids don't get started because they don't know how. They don't know really what to do. So breaking down kind of big complex tasks into smaller, more manageable pieces can be really helpful. These kids tend to get really overwhelmed, so if we can break it down for them, that oftentimes is really helpful. Different study strategies, so it depends a little bit on their learning style, but if they have a hard time remembering random information, try to make the information meaningful for them. Using abbreviations, thinking of something, funny that it's reminding them of, putting it into a rhyme. Those type of things tend to be helpful for that. Teaching them note-taking strategies, so what to focus on, what's important, what's salient information versus what's not. And then we'll talk more about writing and reading. And then helping them with careless errors, so teaching them to edit, teaching them to slow down. Now, a lot of lifestyle changes are actually really helpful for ADHD. Exercise is probably the most effective natural treatment for ADHD. So exercise not only releases endorphins, but it also affects the neurotransmitters in our brain, which are so implicated in ADHD. So it helps to boost focus. So a lot of the kids that I see that struggle with ADHD, they find it really helpful after a full day of school to exercise before they sit down to do their homework. And just for, to help with focus, even small bursts of about 10 minutes of exercise can actually be really beneficial. So they can take little brain breaks and do, a little 10-minute exercise routine, and they'll be fresher again. Sleep is really critical. A lack of sleep absolutely affects attention. We find that about 8 to 10 hours of sleep are recommended for teens. So having good sleep habits is important. Limiting screens. Screens can exacerbate ADHD type symptoms. So having good boundaries around screen time at home is something that's helpful. One would be when they're doing their homework, turning off their phone, or at least, turning off notifications so the phone's not constantly dinging and distracting them. You could have screen-free times at home, maybe dinner time, there's no screens, maybe other family activities, there are no screens. If the bedroom can be a screen-free zone, that can be great. If that's not possible, then having them plug their phone in outside of the bedroom so it's not there during night to ensure that they get a good night's rest. Taking the phone away about an hour before they go to sleep is really helpful because the blue light can interrupt melatonin, so that would be something that could be helpful. We've also found that time in nature or green time can be helpful for ADHD. And we found that the greener the environment, so the more trees, the more plants, the bigger the benefit. And it's independent from exercise. So it would just be, doing something quiet in nature would be just as good. So maybe, time outdoors can be integrated into, a teen's schedule. Diet is important. We find that spikes in blood sugar, are not helpful for ADHD. So we want to keep blood sugar really stable. So focusing on healthy, whole grain, carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables, integrating protein and healthy fats, and really trying to avoid artificial colors and flavoring, kind of the more processed food or too much white sugar. Things like mindfulness, meditation, yoga can be really helpful because it teaches the child to be in the present moment, in the here and now. Oftentimes their minds are going so fast. So those exercises, especially if they include deep breathing, can really help the child kind of be more focused on the present moment, and it kind of slows them down and grounds them. There's also, different vitamins or supplements that might be helpful. There could be good to work with the child's pediatrician to see if there's any deficiencies. Omega-3 fatty acids have been shown to be potentially helpful for ADHD, so things like algae oil or fish oil or chia seeds or flax seeds. There's also a book that's quite helpful for that. It's called Finally Focused by James Greenblatt. That really goes over all of these vitamins and supplements. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Say that author again, please?
Yeah, it's James Greenblatt, and it's called Finally Focused. So let's talk about learning disabilities or learning differences. So about 15% of the population have a learning disability. There's again a genetic component to learning disabilities. And a learning disability means that they're performing below grade level, and there's really a significant discrepancy between their IQ and their academic performance. So they're performing a lot lower than we would think given how bright they are. And learning disabilities can affect self-esteem because oftentimes Kids are really aware of their difficulties, and they're comparing themselves to their peers who may not have to work as hard as they do, so it can affect their esteem and confidence. Now, learning disabilities are grouped by kind of academic areas. So you can have a learning disability in reading, in writing, or in math. There's also dysgraphia, which is the physical act of writing that's more challenging. So let's talk about reading disorder. One area of reading that might be more challenging is, dyslexia. So probably most of you have heard the term dyslexia. There's a lot of misinformation about what dyslexia actually is. So dyslexia is really a problem with phonological awareness. Phonological awareness means being able to manipulate sounds. So people with dyslexia have a hard time hearing the different sounds in language. So if I say cat, you could hear that that's made up of 3 sounds, k, at. And, if I asked you to drop sounds or blend sounds, if you have a hard time doing that just verbally, that might be an indication, that there might be a problem in that area. So because it's so hard they also have a hard time associating a sound with a letter or with a group of letters. And because of that, it's hard for them if they're trying to decode, if they're reading something, a new word maybe that they haven't memorized, they have a hard time sounding that out because they have such a hard time with phonics. Same thing with spelling, because they have a hard time knowing which sounds go with which letters or letter combinations. They're going to have a really hard time spelling that. So let's think of a first grader, who's not going to be a great speller. Of course, they just are learning. Then you read a typical first grader's reading. It might be rattled with spelling mistakes, but you can read it because it's phonetically accurate. You know what they're trying to say. If it's a child who has dyslexia, because it's not phonetically accurate, oftentimes we have no idea what that word is supposed to be. So for young kids, trouble with rhyming might be indicators of dyslexia. Again, spelling that you can't read. For older kids, it would be kids that don't enjoy reading. It's really hard for them. Again, issues with spelling. Another area of dyslexia, they oftentimes have trouble with rapid linguistic retrieval. So how quickly they can pull language from the brain. So for them, they may have that kind of tip of the tongue experience quite often. Other difficulties with reading might be reading speed. So those might just be kids that they might read, beautifully, but they're just slower in their reading. And those might be kids that just in general in their life, they have a slower processing speed. They just have a slower personal tempo. Everything kind of takes them longer. So then that affects, how fast they can read or how fast they can do math or how fast they can write. So that could be another reading disorder. Trouble with reading comprehension could be another area. And one issue might be that working memory that we talked about before. So those might be the ones that get to the end of the page, have no idea what they just read, and they have to reread it to kind of understand it. Or it might be kids that really struggle with inference, or maybe they struggle with language in general, or they have a hard time kind of getting the main points from a text. So there's different, things that we can do to help with reading. One of them would be, if it's something like dyslexia in particular, to work with a reading specialist or an educational therapist to really get at that phonological awareness and strengthen that. Another strategy for a lot of kids that struggle with reading can be audiobooks. And I really like audiobooks, especially when they read along. So I always encourage them to read along. And that can be synced, to a Kindle, or I think Google or Apple might do it too, where it highlights the word while it's reading it, so it's easy for them to follow along. For reading comprehension, some strategies are, especially for like a social studies or science textbook, to read the little summary in the end first, because that will give them some context, kind of like a framework, so they have a better understanding when they're reading the chapter. Annotating or writing in the margins can be really great. So reading a paragraph and trying to identify what are the main points, what are the nuggets that I have to take from this, and writing that in the margins. What can be helpful for that too is taking a sticky note and writing on that who, what, where, when, and maybe how and why. And that's really a way to kind of get at the meat of the text, right? At the most meaningful and important information. Visualizing can be helpful, so picturing something in your mind as you're reading. Reading for answers, especially for something like a multiple choice type test. Reading the answers first, or the question and the answers first before they read the passage can help with that. And then summarizing the main points, so reading a chapter and having a little summary of the main points. So let's talk about math. And math learning disability is also sometimes called dyscalculia, and it occurs in around 5% of the population, and there can be different presentations. So those are kids that have a hard time, or they can have a hard time kind of recognizing numbers and symbols. They may struggle with math concepts, so not really understand what something represents, or not really understand what they're doing as they're solving the problem. They may have a hard time estimating time. For example, they may have a hard time with measurement, length, volume, but even money and making change. They may struggle with number patterns, or they may have visual processing issues, which can make math really challenging because math is so visual. With visual spatial issues, especially geometry would be challenging, or even things like organic chemistry would be really impacted. Or you could have deficits with that executive functioning. Again, there with working memory, they might have a really hard time holding on to the different steps that they have to do to solve math problems. So things that might be helpful to support math, one is would be educational therapy to specifically learn strategies, tutoring, math tutoring. If the kids struggle with visual concepts, using language strategies are really, really helpful. So I oftentimes have them write out the steps, the math steps using language, almost like a recipe, and then they can have that in front of them while they're doing the math problems. Manipulatives and real-world examples can be helpful. Always make sure, especially in high school where math can be really abstract, that they know what they're actually doing. That they understand the concepts. Videos can be great because they can pause it and then they can rewatch it. Khan Academy, for example, is free, it's online, it has a lot of different math things on there. If they have a hard time more like with the organization of their math on the paper and they make a lot of careless errors, using large square graph paper can be really helpful, and just have them put one number in each square. That will help them help things be more lined up, so it's less likely that they make little errors. They can even highlight the signs if they sometimes, just do minus instead of plus because they're not paying attention. Using rhythm or music or songs to help with math facts and times tables and those sort of things that can be more challenging to memorize. Now with writing, if you think about writing, it's really the ultimate executive functioning task, because think about how much information they have to hold in their mind when they're writing. When you're writing, you have to remember your ideas. You have to organize your ideas. You have to think about the reader. You have to remember your spelling and your capitalization, your punctuation and your grammar. So it can be really hard for them to, get their ideas on paper. That can be like a major block for them. Or they may struggle more with the writing mechanics side. So to help with that, if it's more of an issue with spelling grammar, we can, recommend spell check function or Grammarly, those type of things. Graphic organizers can be great because it gives them, helps them to get their ideas out in a visual format. There's an organizational software called Inspiration, which has a lot of graphic organizers and helps with outlines, kind of makes that all more visual. A lot of times it's sitting in front of the blank paper that can be really overwhelming and they have a really hard time getting started. So for that, a brain dump can be really helpful, where you're just taking 10 or 15 minutes and you're just writing down whatever comes to mind, totally uncensored. And then after that, they'll already have half a page or so written, and then they can read through it and edit it from there. But it's easier when you already have something, anything on the page versus just staring at that blank page. For kids that could talk about a subject for hours, but they just can't get it on paper, dictation software can be really helpful. So Siri or Dragon or something like that. Or even if they're in middle school and that's overwhelming, having it, dictating it to their parent or their tutor, and you just kind of take notes for them, can be a really helpful first step, and then kind of editing from there. And then that last area that I mentioned is really difficulty with the actual handwriting, so the process of writing. So that's really, oftentimes these kids struggle with fine motor difficulties in general. And for that, we recommend things like typing. There are much less fine motor demands on typing than there are on handwriting, or using software, dictation software. So that's kind of my run through of, ADHD, attention problems, and learning difficulties. But let me know if you have any specific questions about any of these topics that I might be able to answer for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That was a lot to write.
It's a lot of information.
Oh my God.
Thank you.
One of the things I want to mention also with kids who have ADHD, they also at times struggle with emotional regulation. They sometimes struggle with empathy. They sometimes struggle with social cues. Not all of them, but sometimes. So this can impact their ability to read their peers and read situations. That's something that when your peer relationships get more complex in high school, you might see them be struggling with that, which may trigger some anxiety or depression. You don't see it as much in the younger kids because it's a little bit easier, and then learning how to socialize gets more and more complex. So that is something that we see. Mm-hmm. This is a time for questions. First of all, how many people are from the middle school? Can you raise your hand?
Both.
Oh, great. Oh, both parents. Oh, great. I'm so happy. Thank you for coming this way.
I just wanted to ask more of a shaman question, but so if your child's already been tested and you already know what the issues are,
Yeah.
in the middle school, the only accommodation is extra time on the final.
Yeah.
Is the high school the same situation?
Yeah, they're the same. Yeah, that's a challenge. But I would have to say, what's important is that they learn these strategies at home also. Learning to learn how they learn is going to help them in school. That's sometimes the biggest support is really getting them to understand what they need, how they need to access the information, so that they can become independent later on in life.
I know you guys are offering or maybe working on something to help these kids in February. Yeah, I was talking to the vice principal. You guys are.
Yeah, we are working on it still, so it hasn't been announced, but we're working on maybe some additional academic support here at the school. So
Is that only
stay
for
tuned.
short term, like 6 weeks, or can it be long term?
We're still working on it, so stay tuned.
No, because I'm just wondering if there's a possibility that we could actually get help at school instead of going to.
It will be
I
at
mean,
school. It will be
yeah.
at school. Yeah.
So you guys are working on it.
We're working on it, yeah. Stay tuned for more information.
Yeah, we're working on it. I mean, there's some
Yeah.
things that'll be coming up in the next
Definitely.
couple of
We
years.
see the need,
Yeah.
and we're doing our best to put things in place that will be helpful, because we are limited by our policy and what we're able to provide for students with documentation other than final exam, extended time. So we're just working on implementing things within the school framework that will be helpful. So
Yeah, because it will help us because it's so hard.
Well, last year, the middle school actually had a program called RAMS, and then they dropped it this
Oh.
year. So it was disappointing because my daughter loved it. It was really helpful for her.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into providing those resources.
Yeah.
Having people to man them and
Staff them,
there's a lot
appropriate
of
staff.
factors that go into it. So be reassured that it's on our minds and we're doing our best. So we're just trying to get all those pieces to work together, to provide everything. But that, I don't know what happened at the middle school, but that could be something. A staffing issue, timing, all those things kind of have to come together. So.
What?
I have a question. My daughter, when she studies, she likes to listen to music. Is that type, it's been, for me, I need to focus with no sounds. I can focus, no distraction. Is that tied to ADHD?
It is, yeah. I get it actually a lot with ADHD, and so, like I, kind of briefly mentioned, ADHD really, one of the issues is dopamine, so they don't get as much dopamine, and even listening to music actually increases the level of dopamine. So oftentimes kids with ADHD find it helpful to listen to music, and ideally, it would be music that's not so distracting. Like video games are a good example. They just kind of have this really level kind of music, just background music. So background music like that can be really helpful. But just in general, yes, music can actually help them. It can raise their dopamine, and it can actually help them, make it easier for them to focus.
I know that sounds weird, so think about it. They're easily just distracted, right? So if there's a noise going off in the kitchen, if there's something happening outside, that's going to distract them, and they won't be able to focus. So having that background noise kind of drowns out all the other little tiny things, like a clock in the classroom could be the loudest thing ever. Tick, 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 and so, getting them, and you're going to be, the thing about learning their own strategies is that when you go into the real world, there's going to be things that are distracting you. So that's why it's so important to start learning those personal strategies, for the students, so that when they hear the clock, they'll know what they need to do.
Yeah.
But just to tag on to that,
Yeah.
what kind of music though? As a parent,
Yeah.
I would think,
Beethoven
I've
only.
had that conversation with my daughters. I feel that if you're listening to music and then your mind is wandering, listening to the lyrics and the style of that music, versus I grew up from a generation where, you listen to classical music, then you can concentrate. What is it these days, and what is it like?
Generally, probably kind of calmer music can be helpful. I mean, my 12-year-old has ADHD, and he says it's just so boring that when he listens to Rush at least there's something exciting that kind of just helps them to get going. So, I wouldn't say that's calm music, right? But it just helps them. And, look at the product, right? If you're seeing that with the music, even if you find, whoa, that's kind of a lot, or I couldn't study with that, if they have a good end product, it's working for them, right? And everyone is just different. And if you find that it's really not helping, it's distracting for them, then maybe help them find a different kind of music.
And that's a conversation to have with them. You don't go over, turn it off and say, this is not working. You have to, when they get older, you have to say, is this the best music for you? Are you getting your work done? And having a conversation.
Other things for them might be even like chewing gum or something,
Yep.
or just having a fidget toy, or even, for oftentimes with younger kids, I see them standing, because just by standing, you're activating your brain, you're changing your brain waves. So it's all of those things that they do that actually wake up their brain and help them be more focused. Yeah,
I
go
feel
ahead.
like my son, he listens to rap music, and I'm like, how do you? And then it's like, so loud. But I feel like he's trying to stimulate himself because it's so boring to do
Yeah.
homework. And he did say, yeah, it stimulates me because it is so boring.
Yeah.
So that's how
Yeah,
it is. I
that's what
guess.
my son says, yeah. And it just helps them. And you have to think about their brains are wired differently. So something that would not be helpful, to a typical brain is helpful to them.
Yeah, I didn't understand that first. And then he said,
Yeah.
it stimulates my brain. I'm like, what does that mean? So yeah, I think that makes
Yeah, so if we think about brain waves, an ADHD brain is in a theta brain wave, which is kind of that sleepy brain wave, just kind of before you go to sleep, and you're like thinking it's just this really dreamy brain wave. They're in that for a lot of the day, versus alpha and beta brain wave, which is really more the alert, focusing brain wave. So they need things like that, like the music or the fidgeting that they do actually changes their brain waves. Exercise changes the brain wave. Even hours after you exercise, you have more alpha and beta brainwave activity. That's why that can be so important. And even again, doing those 10-minute little spurts of exercise.
So I'm hoping that, because my son is in academic probation, and he can't do sports. And I feel like for that kind of group of kids who needs that sports, I feel like maybe the counselor could kind of rethink they do need the activity.
Yeah, I mean, even, going on a bike ride, going on a run, jumping on the trampoline, just anything.
But he loves school sports, and I feel like they kind of took that away, because I understand, he didn't do so well academically, but, when we're working with all kinds of different kind of medication, it goes up and down, their grades are gonna suffer. He went into depression, and we actually let him fail, right? And in part of my mind says, okay, we're just gonna let him fail. He has to realize it. But at the same time, he has ADHD. I have to help him. So I don't know. And at the same time, I'm like, well, the school should kind of help him, still stay in with his sports program, because he really needs that. So I'm like,
Well,
can
some
you guys
of
kinda-
it goes beyond us, because it depends on if he's playing with the team. So it's not necessarily a shaman's rule. It's the sports team. So it's something let's talk afterwards.
Yeah. So I'm like,
I know there were a couple of questions back here.
Does it always mean both my kids have to study by just, listening to music? And I know a lot of my friends' kids do the same thing. Does this always mean that it's...
No. Does it mean that you have ADHD because you like to study with music? No. It just helps, helps stimulate your focus. Or it can.
But my son does that, and he, a couple days ago, he was writing a paper, and he always had his headphones. He's like, that's the way I work better. That's the way and then you know what? He gets good grades.
Yeah.
So I'm like, whatever works for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another question, I have two boys. Is there a difference between girls, how girls and boys? I mean, when it comes to this?
In terms of ADHD,
Yeah. I mean, do they...
it's so, oftentimes girls, if they're if they're not hyperactive, tend to fly under the radar. So they're often diagnosed a little bit later, if they're not showing any behaviors, they're just, well-behaved little girls, and, sometimes they think, they're just a little bit dreamy. So oftentimes they might not be diagnosed until a little bit
Or
later.
like they hormones and stuff like that.
Right.
Right?
It could happen too. Go ahead.
What do you recommend for a high schooler as far as the college search goes? I mean, maybe they're hovering, the grades aren't poor and they could possibly get into some better schools, but that might not be the best place for them. And trying to find that fit for them.
That's what I was going to say. Think about fit. So it's not the most prestigious school. It's the school that's the best fit for your child. In my practice, I get kids that go to Ivy League schools, and then they come back and they don't have a job, So it doesn't guarantee, right, that they're going to be successful. You have to find a school that's the best fit for your child. And especially if they're struggling with ADHD or a learning disability, go visit the school, go look at the learning disabilities offices, see what services they're offering, what supports do they provide. If you know that your child is going to need more support, make sure that they get that, at the college. And oftentimes also with college, I always like to start them out with a little bit more support. I'd rather have too much support for them to begin with than not having enough. So if you have to get, a tutor for them that they have a check-in with, once or twice a week, or maybe it's someone in the learning disabilities office, I'd rather start with a little bit more than have them, call you and say, everything's fine, and then, we get the finals and now we're finding out that they're failing. Right? So start them out with a little bit more support, and then you can always back it up. Go ahead.
Any recommendations in distinguishing between learning difficulties and lack of interest?
So with a learning disability, there usually would be like a pretty persistent pattern of that child has always had struggle in that one specific subject. It can be tricky because the thing is with a learning disability, if you're having a hard time, you're probably going to lose interest in that subject and not be, very motivated at one point because it's so hard. I think it can be hard as an outside observer to kind of really tease that apart. I think that's probably where testing might come in. But especially if you think back kind of historically, has there been a time where they've really been trying, but they still didn't get the grades, that they should have gotten, based on the amount of work that they did in, and then it kind of turned or shifted, and now, they're putting less maybe effort into it because it's just hard and they know I'm gonna get a C anyway, so why even try? Go ahead.
How do you know if the educational therapy is working? Because my child's been doing it for a year and a half, and mostly reading. And other than grades, which is very teacher specific, because some parents that I speak to were confused about what the teacher's even doing, or we see the test and the test isn't fair based on what they discussed in class. So it's not a fair measurement of is this educational therapy really helping the reading?
Yeah, so, it's a process. It's going to take a while to learn these skills. And there might be, 5 steps forwards, 2 steps back. The educational therapist might be able to administer like different little assessments so you can get a sense of how they're doing. But in general, thinking back about, how did you feel, or, when you first called that educational therapist, what were your concerns then? Have those concerns be addressed? With educational therapy, there really should be different goals, and you should have pretty consistent meetings with your educational therapist to talk about how they are doing in terms of reaching those goals. And grades are usually the last thing to change, right? It's really more of their attitude towards it, how are they doing with their homework, and then grades take a little bit longer to change.
Are they learning independent skills? Are you seeing them becoming more independent, maybe a little bit more self-confident? But I would say meetings, ask for meetings with them, yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's very informative.
Oh,
first
thank
of all.
you.
And I'm here because of myself. It has nothing to do related to, and I'm really interested about the ADHD and those things to learning. I have a question regarding, maybe it's not related to those things, but is it something genes carry ADHD or no?
Genes?
Genes.
Yes, so there is a genetic component to ADHD. So there's kind of like, so we're still trying to kind of figure out the causes of ADHD.
It's not proved yet, right?
So yeah, we're still working on that, and we really do know that there is a family component. So there is a genetic component to ADHD, but then there's also kind of environmental factors that play a role in whether it gets expressed or not.
And has nothing to do with the vaccines, right?
So the vaccines haven't really been shown.
Recently, all those, survey and those things shows some other vaccines that should have come together. So that's why there's lots of, kids has some difficulties. So if the ADHD is not specific to related to those kind of things, right?
So that hasn't really been, proven that vaccines cause ADHD. I think there's, environmental factors that can contribute, and, things like, toxic exposures, may contribute. Stress can contribute. So there's different factors. It's pretty complicated. So we're still, kind of figuring that out. But it's, even things like airborne stuff. Even LA, right? It's not the healthiest, greenest place, right? We're all exposed to air toxins, just things in the water. There's just more chemicals around now,
I want to ask something. I heard that your practice also includes holistic. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do you
So our approach is really to look at the child in just a more holistic way by thinking about all of the different aspects that might affect the child. So, if we look at their their learning style and things that are more intrinsic, but then we also look at, family interaction. We look at, sleep. What is their sleep like? What is their diet like? So those type of factors to just kind of get a better, more well-rounded understanding how they're doing socially and emotionally. It's really important to take all of those factors into consideration, especially when we're, making a diagnosis.
I just want to say I know you all have so many questions, but we have about 5 more minutes, and then students will be coming in. So we can
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to know if there are any techniques on focusing. You talk about working memory and how kids zone out. I know personally I do that too. I can be sitting in an office and talking, and all of a sudden I'm like, well, what did they just say? So is there any books or any other techniques that are out there that can kind of help with that working memory that you're mentioning, like just not zoning out and focusing? So I just know that my son, if he doesn't care for someone, whether the instructor is picking on him in his mind or whatever it might be, he totally zones out and that's where he struggles, and trying to get back to avoid that and focusing on what the teacher is teaching and not what other, areas that she just kind of turns him off and turns him off.
Yeah, so it's really kind of learning some self-regulation and, some different strategies of kind of bringing your focus back. It's not easy, it's hard for someone with ADHD to kind of utilize those type of behaviors because there is such a strong strain-based difference. But, the more engaging a class is, the more engaging something is presented, that can help. Those little things that we talked about, like music or the fidgeting thing can be helpful in kind of helping them focus. Definitely breaking things down, especially with the working memory, is really helpful because they just get overwhelmed when they're confronted with too much information at once.
sounds like we need to bring her back for some workshop on strategies and.
I think we almost got it.
Go ahead.
Learning styles thing, and thank you for your presentation. I'm like listening to you and I'm checking off the boxes as you went along with both of my children. Question is, I know both my children started out with like a small elementary, middle school, and then now my son's here in the high school, and I feel like I'm trying to determine whether or not there's a need for testing. And I'm just kind of seeing a lot of these things that you're talking about. What would your recommendation in terms of steps to getting to that point where, whether we need to get to the testing part or it's just really helping him achieve time management and those type of, exercises. And then what, second part is that, what are the resources here at the high school in terms of how he can reach out as a student to better understand these things about himself?
Something I'm working on.
Yeah, so to determine, whether testing might be helpful is really to kind of see how is it impacting the child, are their grades suffering? Are they struggling socially? Is it starting to affect their self-esteem? I think that's always like a place, if it's starting to affect them emotionally, I think then there's oftentimes something more there. In the end, I always feel like a parent's intuition, you know your child best, and if you just feel there's just something more there, I don't think it's just laziness or that they're not working hard enough. I think there's more. I think that can be a really good indicator. You can always give me a call and we can talk more specifically, about your child, and I can kind of give you a sense if I think that's kind of falls within the normal development or whether there might be more there.
Okay, just the last two questions.
Okay, go ahead.
If a student is doing well in school, but he's not doing like in finals or test taking because of an anxiety or whatever problem, is that a sign of underlying like ADD? Should he go further to,
If it's only in test-taking situations, it's probably, I think it could be a couple of reasons. I think it could be anxiety, that they might have a test-taking anxiety, or it could be, more like a study strategy problem, where they just don't really know how to study for it, and then they're going in the test and they're nervous because they don't feel prepared. Potentially, it could be a time issue. That would be more if they're finding they just can't finish the test. They know all the answers, but they can't finish. So those would kind of be the three kind of scenarios that will come to my mind.
because all of the symptoms you talked about, a lot of them, like, you can find it in any student.
Right, especially high school.
Even me, I can.
Right.
Very
So it's
self-identified.
always
Yeah, you have to meet.
how often do those symptoms occur? Are they there very consistently? They're not just there 2 weeks out of the year. They're kind of like they're always there,
personality.
and they're severe.
Yeah.
They're affecting them. They're affecting their functioning.
And the grades will be a sign, like, or not necessarily.
They can be a sign. It depends. It depends how well they're able to compensate. So you don't necessarily, have to have poor grades, with ADHD, let's say. If they're really smart and they can kind of pull it together. But oftentimes they'll get to a point where, their academic performance will start to be affected. Sometimes I get college students. They were able to kind of manage in high school because it was still pretty structured and their parents were kind of on top of them and they had a lot of support. But now they're in college and they're all left to their own devices, and now especially those executive issues really get them in trouble.
And that's about building those independent skills younger, so that when they do get to college, they've got some skills already some tools that they can use when they get to college. So as parents, that's a fine balance of how much do I help, how much do I don't help, so. All right, one more, but maybe you can come up because kids are gonna be coming in soon. So I just wanna thank Dr. McDonald.
Thank you so much.
Uh-oh.